The cabin smelled faintly of citrus wipes and brewed coffee, a recycled calm meant to soothe people who carried their own storms on board. Overhead bins slammed shut in uneven rhythms, and the aisle pulsed with the last-minute urgency of passengers trying to pretend they weren't late. She stepped through the doorway with measured calm, the kind that comes from years of moving through spaces where she was noticed late or not at all. Her heels made no sound on the carpet, but she felt every eye flick toward her and away again. She paused, scanning the seat numbers stitched into the armrests. Business class always had a different energy, quieter, heavier with entitlement, lighter with manners that sometimes cracked under pressure. Window seat, right side, just over the wing. She checked the number again, more out of habit than doubt. The boarding pass felt firm between her fingers, as if reminding her it was real, earned, indisputable. Someone was sitting there. A man lounged in the window seat, jacket draped neatly, one leg crossed over the other, his elbow already claiming the armrest like a flag planted in soil. He had the relaxed confidence of someone who had never been asked to prove he belonged. His phone glowed in his hand, AirPods in place, a faint smile tugging at his mouth as if the world existed mainly to entertain him. She stood still for a second longer than necessary, letting the moment settle. Then she leaned slightly forward, voice gentle, steady, impossible to accuse of aggression. "Excuse me," she said. "I believe that's my seat." He didn't look up at first. His thumb continued scrolling, eyes locked on whatever held his attention. When he finally lifted his gaze, it traveled slowly, deliberately, from her shoes to her face, pausing in places that felt less like observation and more like assessment. His smile shifted, turning thin. "I'm already seated," he said, casual. "You can take the aisle." The words were delivered as a solution, not a question. As if he were doing her a favor. A few people nearby pretended not to listen while listening very closely. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the memory of rooms where her presence had been negotiated instead of accepted. "I prefer the seat I paid for," she replied, still calm. He chuckled, a short sound, dismissive. "It's the same thing. You'll be fine." "Fine." The word echoed louder than it should have. She glanced down at her boarding pass, then back up at him. Her eyes didn't waver. "It's not the same," she said. "And it's assigned." He exhaled loudly, rolling his eyes just enough for the audience around them to notice. "Look," he said, lowering his voice as if explaining something obvious to a child. "Business class fills up. People move around. Don't make this difficult." Difficult. Another word layered on top of the first. She felt heat rise behind her ribs, but she held it there, contained. Experience had taught her that reacting fast wasn't power. Holding steady was. A flight attendant approached, her smile practiced, eyes already tired. "Is everything okay here?" The man answered before she could speak. "She's confused about the seating." Confused. The word landed like a quiet insult, sharp enough to draw blood if you noticed it. The attendant turned toward her, polite concern flickering across her face. "May I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" She handed it over without hesitation. The attendant glanced at it, then at the man's pass when he offered it with an exaggerated sigh. Her brow furrowed slightly. "Let me double-check," she said, then walked away toward the front of the cabin. The man smirked, leaning back fully now, reclaiming the window with his shoulder. "Told you." She didn't respond. Instead, she slid into the aisle seat, not as surrender, but as space. She placed her bag beneath the seat, movements unhurried, precise. Inside her chest, thoughts moved faster. She had meetings waiting on the other end of this flight, decisions that would ripple across offices and time zones. She had chosen this flight deliberately, chosen this seat deliberately. Small preferences, maybe, but they were hers. The plane door closed with a dull thud. The sound sealed them all inside together. She pulled her phone from her bag, the screen lighting her face briefly. Notifications stacked neatly, color-coded, urgent and routine woven together. She typed a short message, paused, then added one more line before sending it. Her thumb hovered for half a second, then the screen went dark. Around her, the cabin settled into a hush. Seatbelts clicked. An engine whined softly, not quite awake yet. The man by the window stretched, entirely at ease, his knee nudging the armrest boundary without apology. Minutes passed. The flight attendant returned, accompanied by another crew member. They stood in the aisle, blocking movement, voices low but firm. The attendant looked at the man. "Sir, we need you to move to your assigned seat." He laughed, loud enough to draw attention. "You've got to be kidding me." "I'm afraid not." He pulled one AirPod free. "We're about to leave." "This is ridiculous. We need to correct the seating before departure." A ripple of murmurs traveled through the cabin. Someone behind her whispered something she couldn't quite catch. Another passenger shifted impatiently. The man's jaw tightened. "Why is this even an issue?" he said. "She can sit anywhere. Why hold everyone up?" The attendant glanced at her, then back at him. "Sir, please." "No," she said quietly, cutting through the noise without raising her voice. The word landed clean, final. The attendant looked relieved, surprised, uncertain, all at once. "I won't move," she continued. "That's my seat." Silence spread outward, thick and immediate. Even the engine noise seemed to pause, as if listening. The captain's voice crackled overhead, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're holding briefly while we resolve a seating issue." Holding. Not pushing back. Not rolling. Holding. The man's confidence wavered for the first time. He looked around, suddenly aware of the attention. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. She stood then, slowly, just enough to be seen. Not to intimidate. To exist fully in the space. "I'm not in a hurry," she said. "We can take the time." The attendant nodded, stepping away to make a call. Another crew member spoke quietly into a handset near the galley. The cabin felt suspended, like breath held too long. The man leaned toward her, lowering his voice. "You didn't have to do all this." She met his eyes. "I didn't." Her phone buzzed once in her hand. She didn't look at it yet. The plane remained grounded, unmoving, the moment stretching thin with expectation. And in that pause, between engines and ego, between assumption and fact, something shifted, subtle but irreversible, setting the stage for everything that would follow. The silence didn't last long. It fractured into whispers, the soft rustle of impatience, the sharp inhale of people who suddenly felt involved. A man 2 rows back leaned into the aisle, craning his neck as if proximity might grant him context. A woman across from her adjusted her scarf, eyes flicking between the window seat and the aisle with thinly veiled judgment. The cabin lights seemed brighter now, unforgiving, exposing every expression. The man shifted in the window seat, irritation leaking through his posture. He straightened his blazer, tugged the cuff of his sleeve, and glanced at his watch as if time itself were on his side. "This is absurd," he said again, louder this time. "I have a connection." She didn't look at him. Her gaze rested forward, steady, her reflection faintly visible in the curved surface of the overhead bin. She could feel the tension in her shoulders, the pull to explain herself, to smooth the edges for everyone else's comfort. She resisted it. She had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that comfort given too freely often came at a cost. A flight attendant stepped into the aisle again, joined now by a supervisor with a sharper uniform and a presence that carried authority without announcement. They spoke quietly, heads inclined, eyes darting briefly toward her and then back to the man. "Sir," the supervisor said, voice even, "we need you to move." He scoffed, shaking his head. "You're really doing this? Over a seat?" "Yes," she replied. "Over a seat." He laughed, but there was an edge to it now, something brittle. "Unbelievable," he said, turning toward the surrounding passengers as if appealing to a jury. "Anyone else think this is ridiculous?" A few people looked away quickly. One man shrugged, non-committal. Someone else muttered, "Just move already." The words landed unevenly, some aimed at him, some at her, all of them heavy with implication. The supervisor's eyes flicked to her again. "Ma'am," she said carefully. Would you consider taking another seat so we can depart? The request was soft, almost apologetic. It carried the weight of convenience, the unspoken suggestion that the path of least resistance should always bend toward the same people. She turned then, meeting the supervisor's gaze fully. No, she said again, not louder, not sharper. Just firm. The supervisor inhaled, held the breath for a moment, then nodded once. Understood. The captain's voice returned overhead, still calm, but now edged with finality. Ladies and gentlemen, we will remain at the gate until the seating issue is resolved. Thank you for your patience. Remain at the gate. Grounded. A collective sigh rolled through the cabin. Someone behind her muttered something about entitlement. Another voice, softer, said, Good for her. The words tangled together, impossible to separate. The man's face flushed. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on her profile. You're really enjoying this, aren't you? He said under his breath. She turned to him then, slow enough to make him wait. I'm enjoying being respected, she replied. There's a difference. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a split second, uncertainty flickered across his face, quickly masked by irritation. He looked away, jaw tight, fingers drumming against the armrest. Minutes dragged. The air felt thicker, warmer. The sense of movement that usually preceded takeoff was absent, replaced by stillness that magnified every sound. A child somewhere up front began to fuss. A phone chimed, then was quickly silenced. The supervisor spoke quietly into a handset, turning slightly away. The flight attendants moved with restrained urgency, checking rows, exchanging looks. The cabin had become a waiting room for consequence. She felt her phone vibrate again in her palm. This time she glanced down. A short message, direct, familiar in tone. She typed a response just as brief, then slipped the phone back into her bag. Her pulse remained steady. Whatever came next, she was ready. The man shifted again, finally standing halfway, then sitting back down as if unsure whether to commit to the motion. This is getting out of hand, he said louder now, frustration spilling over. I'm not moving. The supervisor turned back toward him. Sir, if you refuse to comply, we will involve security. Security. The word cut through the noise. A hush followed, immediate and tense. You can't be serious, he said, incredulous. I am, the supervisor replied. He laughed again, but it sounded hollow. All this for her? The word her hung in the air, loaded, pointed. A few heads snapped toward him. The supervisor's expression hardened. All this, she said, because you are not in your assigned seat. The distinction mattered. She felt it land, precise and corrective. The man looked around, suddenly aware that the room was no longer on his side. His shoulders slumped just a fraction. He ran a hand through his hair, then straightened, trying to reclaim control. Fine, he said sharply. Let's see how far you want to take this. She watched him from the aisle seat, her expression unreadable. Inside, memories surfaced uninvited, conference rooms where her ideas had been repeated by others and praised more loudly, meetings where she had been mistaken for support staff, moments where she had been asked to prove, again and again, what others were assumed to be. Each memory tightened her resolve, not with bitterness, but with clarity. The supervisor stepped aside to make another call. The captain's voice did not return immediately. Time stretched, elastic and unforgiving. A woman across the aisle leaned slightly toward her, voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, she said. That you even had to ask. She met the woman's eyes, offered a small smile. Thank you. The man noticed the exchange and scoffed, shaking his head. Unreal, he muttered. The supervisor returned, posture straighter now, eyes sharper. She looked at the man. This is your final request. He stood abruptly, the movement drawing startled gasps. For a moment, it seemed as if something else might happen, something louder, messier. But then his shoulders dropped. He grabbed his bag from the overhead bin with unnecessary force. This is discrimination, he said bitterly. I'm being singled out. The supervisor didn't flinch. You are being corrected. The distinction landed again, heavier this time. As he stepped into the aisle, he hesitated, turning back toward her. His expression had shifted, confusion edging into something like curiosity. Who are you? He asked, not mocking now, but searching. She met his gaze evenly. Someone who doesn't give up her seat. He shook his head, scoffing once more, but the sound lacked conviction. He moved down the aisle, guided firmly by a flight attendant, his earlier confidence stripped away by the weight of consequence. The cabin remained still, expectant. No applause yet. No release. Just the charged quiet of a moment not yet finished. The supervisor turned to her then, voice lower, respectful. Ma'am, she said, could you come with me to the front for a moment? She stood, smoothing her jacket, aware of every eye following her. As she stepped forward, the plane remained grounded, the door still sealed, the story unfinished. And in that suspended space, anticipation tightened its grip, promising that what came next would change more than just the seating chart. She followed the supervisor toward the front of the cabin, the narrow aisle opening just enough to let her pass. Every step felt measured, deliberate, not because she was unsure, but because she understood what moments like this did to people watching. The whispers trailed behind her, questions forming silently in rows of curious faces. Who was she? Why was the flight still grounded? What could possibly justify this kind of delay? At the galley, the supervisor stopped and turned to face her, lowering her voice. The hum of equipment filled the space between them, steady and impersonal. Thank you for your patience, she said. We're just clarifying a few details. She nodded once. Take your time. The supervisor studied her more closely now, not with doubt, but with interest. May I ask, she said carefully, what you do for a living? She didn't smile. I run companies. The words weren't boastful. They were factual, like stating the weather. The supervisor's eyebrows lifted slightly, then settled back into place. She stepped aside to answer a call, turning her back but not fully leaving. Her tone shifted instantly, more formal, more alert. Yes, she's here, understood. The call ended. The supervisor turned around, posture straightened, shoulders squared. There was something different in her expression now, something closer to recognition. Ma'am, she said, voice respectful. We've received a communication from corporate operations. She waited. They've asked us to ensure your seat is restored immediately and that you're comfortable for the remainder of the flight. The words landed quietly, but their impact rippled outward. She felt it not as triumph, but as confirmation. Thank you, she said simply. The supervisor hesitated, then added, They also asked us to apologize. She inclined her head slightly. Apology accepted. As they turned back toward the aisle, the energy in the cabin had shifted. The man who had taken her seat stood near the middle rows now, his bag slung awkwardly over one shoulder, his face tight with restrained disbelief. He watched her approach, eyes narrowing as if trying to fit her into a story he understood. The supervisor raised her voice just enough to be heard. Sir, she said, you'll be seated in your assigned row now. He scoffed. You still haven't explained what's going on. The supervisor didn't blink. You were not in your seat. The matter is resolved. He laughed once, sharp and incredulous. Resolved? By humiliating me? A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. The word humiliation hovered, misplaced but potent. She stopped walking and turned toward him. The aisle seemed to shrink around them, the moment drawing everyone in despite themselves. No, she said calmly. You humiliated yourself when you decided you belonged somewhere you didn't. The man stared at her, stunned. For the first time since the exchange began, he didn't have a response ready. His mouth opened, then closed. Who do you think you are? He demanded, louder now, desperation bleeding into the edges of his voice. The supervisor answered before she could. Sir, that's not relevant. It is to me, he snapped. She took a breath, slow and grounding, then met his gaze. I'm the person whose seat you took, she said. And I'm also the person your airline contacted 10 minutes ago because this delay triggered a priority protocol. Murmurs rippled through the cabin like wind through tall grass. Someone gasped softly. A phone lifted, then lowered again, unsure whether to capture the moment or respect it. The man's face strained of color. That doesn't make sense, he said weakly. This is a seat. She nodded. That's what I said. The supervisor gestured gently but firmly toward the aisle ahead. Please move, sir. He hesitated, eyes darting between her and the supervisor, as if waiting for someone to contradict what he was hearing. No one did. The authority in the space had shifted, and he felt it. He moved stiffly down the aisle, guided by a flight attendant whose expression was professional but unyielding. As he passed her, he slowed, curiosity overtaking pride. What do you do? He asked again, quieter now, stripped of challenge. She looked at him, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, but with something closer to clarity. I build things, she said. And I don't step aside when someone tries to take them. He swallowed, nodded once, then looked away, the weight of the answer settling heavier than any reprimand. She returned to the window seat at last. The armrest felt cool beneath her hand, the space unmistakably hers. The wing waited outside, unchanged, patient. She buckled her seatbelt as the supervisor leaned in. If there's anything you need, she said, please let us know. She smiled, small but genuine. Just a smooth flight. The supervisor straightened, then turned to the cabin. Thank you for your patience, everyone. We're ready for departure. A beat passed. Then applause broke out, not thunderous, not performative, but sincere. It rolled through the rows in uneven waves, hands clapping not just for her, but for the correction of something that too often went unchallenged. She didn't look around. She kept her eyes on the window, on the city waiting beyond the glass. The engines roared to life. The plane began to move. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, the tension drained slowly, replaced by a hum of conversation. A woman across the aisle caught her eye and nodded, lips forming a silent thank you. She returned the nod, understanding passing cleanly between them. The captain's voice came over the speakers again, warmer now. We appreciate your cooperation today. We're cleared for takeoff. The plane accelerated, pressing her back into the seat as the ground rushed away. The city dropped beneath them, shrinking into geometry and light. She watched it recede, thoughts settling into place alongside the clouds. She thought about the meeting waiting for her, the negotiations already underway, the future she was shaping with decisions made quietly, deliberately. She thought about how easily people mistook calm for weakness, silence for permission. As the seatbelt sign chimed off and the cabin relaxed into cruising altitude, she exhaled fully for the first time since boarding. The worst was over. The truth was out. And though the consequences were still unfolding behind her, she felt no need to look back. The moment had turned. The resolution was inevitable now. The applause faded as quickly as it had risen, dissolving into the soft murmur of conversation and the familiar routines of flight. The plane climbed steadily, the engines smoothing into a constant hum that felt almost reassuring now. She rested her head lightly against the seat, eyes following the thin line of the wings slicing through a sky so blue it felt unreal. From up here, the conflict already seemed smaller, but the meaning of it did not. A flight attendant approached with a tray, her smile warmer than before. Can I get you something to drink? Water is fine, she replied. The attendant nodded, then hesitated just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. And thank you, she added quietly, as she handed over the glass. She met the attendant's eyes, understanding exactly what the thanks was for. You did your job, she said. That matters. The attendant smiled, visibly relieved, and moved on. Behind her, somewhere past the rows of heads and tray tables, the man who had taken her seat sat stiffly in his assigned place. He hadn't spoken since moving. His earlier confidence had collapsed inward, leaving behind a man suddenly aware of how thin his armor had always been. Every time the cart rattled past, Every time laughter bubbled up from another row, he flinched as if reminded that the flight had continued without him at the center of it. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Closure, she had learned, didn't require an audience. As the cabin settled fully into cruising altitude, conversations turned ordinary again. Someone discussed weekend plans. Another passenger laughed at something on a tablet. Life resumed its rhythm, but it carried an aftertaste now, subtle and lingering. A woman from the row behind leaned forward slightly. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," she began, cautious. "But that was powerful." She turned, offering a gentle smile. "I mind if people stay silent," she said. "Not if they speak kindly." The woman nodded. "I wish I'd had your courage once," she said, then sat back, eyes thoughtful. Courage. The word floated for a moment, then drifted away. She had never thought of it that way. To her, it had been simpler than courage. It had been refusal. Refusal to shrink. Refusal to smooth things over so others wouldn't feel discomfort they had caused themselves. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was longer. She read it slowly, then typed a response that ended with a single sentence. When she pressed send, she felt a weight lift that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The airline would remember this flight. Not because of the delay, but because of what it exposed. Policies would be reviewed. Training would be discussed. Names would be mentioned in rooms far removed from this cabin. She didn't take pleasure in that. She took comfort in it. An announcement chimed softly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be turning on the seatbelt sign briefly due to light turbulence." The plane trembled just a little, a reminder that stability was never permanent, only maintained. She adjusted her seatbelt, fingers brushing the metal buckle, and smiled faintly at the metaphor. A while later, as the cabin lights dimmed slightly, she closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to reflect. She remembered the first boardroom where she'd been asked whose assistant she was. The first contract negotiation where her silence had been mistaken for ignorance. The first time she realized that being underestimated wasn't always an obstacle. Sometimes it was leverage. The plane moved through a patch of clouds, sunlight diffusing into soft white brightness. She opened her eyes again, watching shadows slide across the wing. Somewhere below, people were living their lives, unaware of the small reckoning that had taken place above them. When the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for descent, the supervisor passed by once more. She paused beside her seat. "I wanted to say," she began, choosing her words carefully. "You handled that with a lot of grace." Grace. Another word people used when they meant restraint. "Thank you," she said. "But next time, don't ask someone to give up what's already theirs." The supervisor nodded, the message landing fully. "Understood." As the plane began its descent, the man behind her finally spoke, his voice low and tight. "I didn't think—" He stopped, then tried again. "I made an assumption." She turned in her seat just enough to meet his eyes. He looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence. The certainty he'd boarded with was gone. "Yes," she said. "You did. I'm sorry," he added quickly, the words tumbling out before pride could stop them. She studied him for a moment, not searching for sincerity but recognizing it when she saw it. "I accept," she said. "Learn from it." He nodded, swallowing, and leaned back without another word. The wheels touched down with a firm jolt, applause erupting again out of habit this time. As the plane taxied toward the gate, she felt a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. Not victory, not revenge, but alignment. Things had ended where they should have begun, with respect. When the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers stood and reached for bags. The aisle filled with movement and chatter. As she rose, several people stepped aside instinctively, offering space without realizing why. She moved calmly, unhurried. At the door, the captain stood greeting passengers. When she reached him, he paused. "Thank you for your patience today," he said sincerely. She nodded. "Thank you for backing your crew." Outside the aircraft, the terminal buzzed with life, announcements echoing, luggage wheels clicking across tile, the smell of coffee and perfume mingling in the air. She stepped into it fully, her stride confident, her posture relaxed. Behind her, the man hesitated at the doorway, watching her disappear into the crowd. The lesson would follow him longer than the flight ever could. She walked on, phone already in hand, the next chapter waiting to be written. The seat had never just been a seat. It had been a line. And she had held it. Because sometimes, it only takes 1 minute, one refusal to move, for the ground beneath a system to shift. And once it does, nothing lands the same way again.